already 12. So, hi everyone. I guess first I would need to let everyone know that we will be recording this session. So hopefully everyone's fine with that. Sorry, just a second, please. All right. We are really pleased to resume our Architalks online. Well, the feedback we've received from people encouraged us to continue virtually. I will definitely announce the next ones through emails and social media, so please stay tuned. So there we go. Today's presenter is Professor Nathaniel Belcher, previously a professor of architecture at Pennsylvania State University in the USA. And he was educated at both Virginia Tech and Harvard University and holds a postgraduate qualification in architecture. Nat's international experience as both an artist and architect is a great complement to our school, which basically covers a range of discipline areas from digital and creative design to architecture, geography, and so on. So I guess we are very privileged to have Nat here with us today, as he is a busy man. So thank you, Nat, for accepting to be our first online Architalker.
Okay, thank you. So first, I'd like to give respect and knowledge to the Wudjak-Noongar people as the traditional custodians on the land on which we regularly work, travel, and live. So that's the. I'm going to try to go through. This is trying to place some experiences I've had and an ongoing conversation I've had with staff here at the DBE about where I see both the school and a little bit the opportunity and the context that we're operating in. So it's not just about architecture or architectural practices. I think it's a little broader, and hopefully it's an ongoing conversation with the staff, the community, and professionals and students that are interested as a way of I think really helping to define what the design and built environment as a school is becoming and how we can work together. So a couple table setting things is to try to originally to begin with this notion of the context that we're in. And there's some things that are sort of happening that have always been very critical, I would say, as table setting events that can start to set the context. So in a sort of large global sense, there's the notion of the climate imperative, more specifically a sort of energy imperative. And I think it relates largely to the way in which we which I have had most of my experiences deliver and communication think about architecture. So if I think about buildings, we can look at a building in the northern part of the United States that has a building infrastructure where only 5% of it goes towards the building of the building and literally towards the infrastructure going towards building systems is basically the fireplaces, 5% of the cost. Or a current building which does something similar is the hydro building in Manitoba, similar climate, but over 50% of it goes towards the management of energy and the sort of comfort and occupation of the building, the systems. So there's a complex change in everything that we do and see in the built environment. So there's I would say, a climate crisis and an energy imperative crisis. But also, this has also, I think, been changed dramatically by what might be called a pandemic crisis or concern. So this is something that's very, very recent, and it's hard for me not to think of the broader sense of what the DBE is doing or my role within it or what we're trying to do collectively without acknowledging the conditions. And the major concern quite clearly is the beginning with the thinking of the collegiality and the wellness of all concerned. So we've worked very closely with maintaining communication with staff and and students through different means as the university has, and there's a sense of wellness and an understanding of the context that we're in. So just to let's sort of continue with that sort of notion of context. So just to clarify a little bit about the crisis, and I know a lot of my changes in terms of the slides, they've been kind of flattened in a way that I didn't expect. So some of the colors might be a little off. Is that this is a dynamic situation, and that everything that is occurring is a certain amount of anxiety. What's true and not true is going to be changing dramatically in the long term. What's precedented and unprecedented really has to be put in the context of a sense of risk and tolerance that we all bring to bear, and that much of what we're talking about and thinking about changes over time. So as I thought about putting together this presentation, it began to be clear to me that that we have a real pause that we're facing, that much of what we deal with in the built environment has changed in a way that we hadn't really foreseen, given the sort of set of events that have happened more recently. And so this is the sort of moment where I don't think we've ever, in the modern economy, we've never seen a complete stop in the way we have, especially as we relate to sort of common notions of economy, GDP, or modernism. So this is a sort of special moment, and I think we can deal with it in ways that I think are really quite valuable. So our collective judgment is really critical, and how we respond to everything is gonna really allow for a certain amount of success or failure going forward. So that's in some ways this table setting, but I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about some ways in which I think about the role of design education and a certain amount of, and a thesis around what really inspires me to participate or work with our colleagues, and what I see as a kind of currency or context in design and architecture. That the DBE responds and deals with a lot of critical making practices is something that I think is very important. This is something that has been the subtext of my particular interest involved in architecture, but also in design education. And there's a kind of thesis that I would bring through here that's going to be hard to read because the contrasting of the text behind it. But it is basically the notion that design education has dealt with a certain amount of volatility throughout its history, and that will continue, and that much of what we're doing is going to have to be resoundingly successful actually in responding to that. That there are many current challenges to architecture, but there's also many opportunities. So I think design education really has to deal with progress, and it really evolves dramatically around a certain amount of resistance, and that this is actually an energy to what we do as architects. And that this happens, and it's not without both critical and professional changes and challenges that are really important. And that the changes associated with this, in the end, on balance, are very good for what we do and what we deliver in terms of design education. Is also important and good for the practices that we support. And that we need a certain amount of volatility and we need a certain amount of chaos, I think, in order to be successful. So that would be the premise of my sort of thesis for beginning. Step back a little further and talk about some of my experiences at watching and going through that. There are two, I would say, critical experiences which I've been involved with. One is the formation and the accreditation of the New School of Architecture in Miami, Florida, at Florida International University, where we were bringing together architecture, landscape architecture, interior design in a new school, and eventually graphic design as well, to look at professional practices that dealt with delivery of design broadly. We went through a real careful, I would say, process where we were looking at internationalization, sort of new practices, digital applications, and it was a collective experience where we looked at it quite broadly. A second experience that's maybe relevant, and that was done, I would, in the latter part of the 90s to the 2000s. In 2010, I was invited and became the head of a new school of architecture at Penn State University. And it was an existing school which was renamed the H. Campbell and Ellen R. Stuckman School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, and it in many ways was focused on the sort of redesign of traditional traditional programs in delivering architecture and landscape architecture, two of the oldest in the country. And what that really taught me was that there was a context of media and culture that architecture really needed to respond to, but it also talked about in many ways, especially in the context of the United States, the best practices of the last century of the way in which architecture would result, both in terms of its infrastructure, in terms of its pedagogy. It really represented where architectural design, as it had grown out of the United States and the studio experience, out of the Beaux-Arts and the technical traditions, really manifests itself in terms of certain types of practice. And it's from those two experiences that I look at and I'm trying to involve the staff here around the strategy for the design and built environment. The design and built environment is a school which combines two legacy programs, the design programs out of the former school of design and arts, as well as the traditional practices in the built environment, mainly architecture and planning. But it sits within the context of the strongest traditions of university in Perth. That's Curtin University. And it has a strategy, I think, which leads to three pillars: learning, student experience, research and innovation, student engagement and impact. And the university sets up a template by which its faculties, as well as its particular schools, respond to the sort of core interests. At the humanities level, it's a discussion of planet, people, technology, and at the school, it is the formation of a position statement. And in this conversation with the staff more recently, we've had a work day and we've spent the last month and a half working with strategic planning in the university to really look at what that means for the school, and have come up with and are developing an ongoing conversation about a position statement, which really looks at some of the deeper evolution of what this means for us, what cultural reconciliation, what the worldwide understanding, a global imperative, collaborative partnership, practice-based excellence, as well as innovative design research is a really important subtext to the way in which we practice and understand architecture. So that would be the sort of context around strategic planning and particular experiences leading up to today. The other thing I'd like to talk a little bit is about the sort of design in a broader sense as it relates to us, and a sort of purpose or a reason for us to be here. And it has many levels, some very practical in many ways, some very, I would say, conceptual, or some, in a sense, humane. So what's on this list, which is kind of hard to see given the contrast of the slide, is this notion of the cognate areas, which is architecture, climate, construction management, design, geography, interior architecture, project management, and urban and regional planning. These are the sort of areas that occupy our staff, and in many ways they support and adjacent with the areas that are focused in terms of our research. And a principal or research area is the Curtin University Sustainable Policy Institute, which is another part of the school as well. So I also think that when we think about why we exist, what we do, we service generalist disciplines. All of our disciplines in many ways are involved in a certain amount of understanding of specific deliverables of very useful parts of the way in which the built environment is created. And I think in that respect, it is a professional school. As professional as something might be traditionally law or medicine, I think the design practices themselves begin to assert as a kind of professional agenda and way of understanding the world. And so one of the goal of our courses and the school is to impact and to be impacted by the world around us. One of the biggest currencies that comes out of the conversation with our staff is the notion of curiosity that we deal with. The relationship of core competencies about the deliverables of architecture, design, interior architecture, geography, planning, and the rest is a really important way in which we think about what we work. We're emphasizing research excellence, pedagogical excellence, and different types of pedagogical practices that I think are really important for us to understand. The DBE has a disproportionate impact on the built world, and we can assert and control a lot of ways in which the world around us is made, from the objects that we confront directly, to the images we see, to the cities we plan, and to the buildings that we build in those cities. So I think it is an incredibly useful and important collection of disciplines that are relevant to us. But another way to look at this and to think about it is maybe to take one discipline, which I have a lot more experience understanding and working within, and that would be to look at architecture. And so the architecture and the purpose for its existence in many ways has a certain amount of public mission, that architectural education has a strong contribution to the discipline of architecture broadly, but architectural education also has a certain amount of professionalization because it exists within a legal structure. Now, the legal structure is a professional act that you have here in Australia, but you also have in the United States, and supported by a series of mechanisms that define and allow architectural education to exist. These are the organizations that become the bodies of regulation, professional practitioners, educators, students, the accreditors, as well as the public, all come together to give us what I would say a certain understanding of architecture. But architecture responds in many ways as a discipline, as do many of the other courses within the school that deal with certification of competency. And the certification of competency, I think, is really relevant and important for us to consider, but it is a certification of competency, full stop. It is not as much an aspiration or the ultimate where we intend to go. So one of the other sort of settings that I would like to talk about is what pedagogical excellence would be within that sort of specific body. If you take the architecture discipline and you think that within a specific body of knowledge, within architecture is the accredited aspects of it, there are ways in which that's delivered. And those deliverables have to do with an understanding of history, technology, building practitioner, as well as a certain amount of commitment to project-based, centered, and verbal assessments. So the project-centered education that we deliver, most usually defined by the studio experience, is in many ways the unique contribution of what we bring to the design practices broadly within the school. Much of the work that we do is around a context where we deliver singular ideas and look at comprehensive delivery of projects. So the space of practice becomes really important, and it really is important in terms of where we're going and what we're seeing happening within the school itself. So project-centered education is this notion that the project itself is a holistic idea. It is a comprehensive project where we present something or an idea around verbal, graphic, holistic, and analytical methods. And all of our disciplines do that through different means and through different processes. So it is the holistic evaluation that's most critical. It is this idea of an analytical evaluation that is assessment of key criteria. Designers bring in things that are very different, and it is a methods of evaluating work for both the public and us all to engage. one of the most important aspects of doing that is the public review and the sort of exhibit of the work to be shared. The building that we are blessed to be receiving on campus is a real assessment of the intentions and the aspirations of what the design and built environment can bring both to the university, but also to the community, but to the broader understanding of our professional practices as a whole. The building represents much of the possibilities of engagement, much of the ways in which we could communicate and share design. And the building in many ways is a tool and a mean for the practices and the deliverable of project-based education. There are spaces that are really dedicated to that understanding in which we exist. So that would be a little bit more of the context that I think is relevant to understand of what I think is really important coming together as we look at the building, as we look at the school in general, or that I'm observing. The other thing I think is important to think about is the sort of broad context of society in general, that we look at identity research, community practice, inclusion, and social justice as all evolving simultaneously and having a broad impact on we engage as individuals, but also as a collective. And if we think about that, there are generational ways in which that might be understanding both the deliverables and receiving of education, but also the way in which we build and understand the world itself. That generation might be defined by time, moments, and expressions of experience, and how that comes together and impacts us is also another subtext that I think is important for us to keep in mind. So there's a list of ways in which we think about knowledge, we think about the built environment, we think about the way in which we engage with the world, and it might be about self-defining, the dynamic ways of building, dynamic ways of living, and dynamic ways of dealing with the world. That we're really challenged to be very lucid, to be very event-focused in a context that has changed dramatically, especially given what's happened most recently, but in the larger trends of what's happening around us in the world. Next chapter. To step back again and maybe to sort of try to pull this together to look at where these curriculums are looking or helping us to think about currencies. I was involved in 2007, before I started dealing with education, in writing what a 21st curriculum might look like, which is a sort of evolving understanding and thinking of practice that has really helped impact the scope and the ways in which I engage both the DBE, but I think about what's relevant to higher education and tertiary education as you describe it here, and what we're doing here at the DBE. At the core of that is a certain amount of understanding of practice and criticism, about emerging critical and professional vocabularies that can significantly change design within increasingly porous and interdependent worlds of studio and building practice. And I think that is really a large part of what I think is really relevant to us to understand. So what does that mean in terms of the day-to-day delivery? An example in architecture is that if we take the body of knowledge that we understand as an architect or as a designer, and we look at it the way it might have been thought of traditionally, the amount of understanding of awareness, of information, understanding information, point of awareness, introduction of the discipline, understanding, and then the ability to interact with it. The tools for accessibility over the beginning to advanced was in the core of a curriculum, a 5-year experience. And the accessibility to do that at the lower arc of this this sort of diagram is where we were before we started talking about advanced technologies. And if we talk about advanced technology, both delivering of curriculum and also conceptually rethinking the way in which we look at the world, we can see that all that has changed dramatically, and that many of the tools and ways of instruction can be accelerated to the point where the beginning of the education can bring us to an ability level much sooner, and to the application and the understanding of what that means for our disciplines moving forward can be thought of very differently. What this is what is the sort of day-to-day implication of the notions of technology, globalization, and consolidation into the way in which we work and practice as designers. And what that has led to in many ways are some real milestones. So the first is the notion of globalization, technology, and consolidation. The second is the working through of what that means for us in terms of education in the United States, what that means is very literal imperatives written into the way in which we write curriculum to sort of take the notion of design, and for architecture it meant the application of notions of cradle to grave, of notions of advanced technology into of energy into the way in which we delivered and worked in practice. Specifically, the idea that a building would be looking at reduced energy to net zero energy down to energy neutral to energy positive as a way of thinking about that. The other idea that I think is relevant to this that would be helpful is looking for strategies that look at the future and develop an enterprise plan and sort of strategies for what might be called blue sky or blue ocean strategies, that we look to the future for ways of thinking about architecture as our practice is a really important part. So Paul Nakazawa is a gentleman who taught professional practice at SciArc in Los Angeles for 20 years. And he would always approach architects to think about the way in which they work, less about a day-to-day thinking and more about where we are in the future. We are ultimately a future enterprise. And that rather than dealing with what might be called the red ocean of competition, we might really think about building our own ways of practicing and building in the world. So with that in mind, I wanted to talk a little bit more about, and coming to a sort of point of conversation about what this might look like. One is the characteristics of a new curriculum as it was originally thought, just to summarize, had to do with trends in technology in the year 2000, which would be technology, globalization, consolidation, the notions of sustainability, and this idea of creating your own world or island to practice as an architect. What that meant more recently, in the not too distant future, the last 10 years, has been the notion of data computation, climate change, digital fabrication, as well as the idea of credentialing and accreditation as an important subtext for where we want to go. And I would say that where we think about new curriculum in the future, we want to think about the global accreditation and licensure are things that will typically come and go, and that there's a certain amount of blurring the lines of disciplinary separation that we need to think about. This idea of interdisciplinarity and sort of overlap becomes an important subtext. And the idea of an individualized or customized education references community colleges in the States, but more importantly here is the notion of TAFE, or broader sense of working broadly across the educational spectrum, as well as the idea that we respond to demographics that are relevant to us in higher education. And so there's some larger areas that I think are opportunities for us: entrepreneurialism, the notion of being flexible and nimble, a certain amount of ecological imperative, as well as a research imperative that I think is really important for us to think about. That we need to think about borderless practices. I think that's still relevant, and the notion of a certain amount of aesthetic arbitrage in the way in which we image and present our work. And that there is this idea that technology is ubiquitous and important. And so this was, in many ways, to set up the context of real opportunities. And this was done in a world that was thinking a little bit differently and predates some of the sort of emergencies we've dealt with in my thesis. And in the end, I think a certain amount of volatility and chaos is a strength to what we bring to the table. So getting back to the initial idea of where we are right now, I think that what I see is really important for the school and for practice in general is to really think about what research can bring to us and what excellence means in the context of whatever context it's in, whatever discipline is relevant, and that we as a school can bring a certain amount of curricular enhancement and excellence in that context. In many ways, we have that charge. That also we have to think about this as something that's changing and I think aggressively very relevant. But in the end, in the midst of what's happened, we have the ability to really accelerate this process. And that ultimately we have values as a school which can, in many ways, work to benefit us. And those values are things that are very much here, and that there's a certain amount of prescient opportunity that's right in front of us to make what would call a better future. And to close on a certain anecdote, I would say that if we think holistically about what's about to happen with the sort of starting and restarting of the pressure and depressurization of the world we're in, there's a big debate that might be talking a little bit about of climate change and also about energy or the fossil fuel. And so the anecdote is that, are we going to continue towards the change, or is the future going to force a certain amount of acceleration? Are we going to go back to where we were 6 months or a year ago? So I know that's a lot to take in, and I really apologize for the slides. A lot of the subtext that I'm talking about got washed in the letter, but I would love to hear any thoughts or reactions to what I just did, what I just said. So thanks. Teresa, is Alex, are there any questions or comments?
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Yes, we would like to take some questions, and I think someone raised his or her hand already. So I just can't see who the person was.
It was John.
But feel free to, go ahead, Alex. Yep.
The person who raised their hand was John, but he seems to have dropped out of the session. He'll come back shortly.
Okay. Anybody else? Julian.
All right, next is Julianne Kissling.
Hi, Julian.
Alex, can give him mic, please?
Hi, Nat. Yeah, thanks for doing the talk. It was pretty insightful, and it's nice to see what the plans are in terms of the future of Curtin as a university and its role in education system. And the role that technology might play in the future of delivering education and Curtin becoming like a global, global. Do you see any risks that you're trying to perhaps mitigate in the future with technology?
Yeah, so I mean, there are obvious risks around sort of the sharing of information in a sort of the digital environment. There's also a lot of risk that we're dealing with day to day right now, especially given the sort of impact on the economy. So as we are an invested, we're an area of investment for the university. We also have to do that in a context which it's probably had less, I would say, it's less sort of open resources than it had in the past. So as I was, and it might have been very clear, I think the constant communication and the understanding of what is real in terms of the way we're going to sort of move forward. So I do think there are a lot of risks, especially if we think about the cost of implementing anything. I think and the building, in many ways, the commitment that the university and in many ways the community has placed on us is much more of an opportunity than a risk. I think we'll get through this the next 6 months to a year. And I'm much more excited about what we can do given the platform that the building represents, and also the sort of collection of staff that are engaged in research and the students that we have. I think that's a much richer opportunity, but I would have to say there are risks.
Cool. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Justin?
Hi, Nat. Thanks very much for that talk. It was fascinating. I was just going to ask one question. I was wondering if you might be able to expand a bit on the concept of aesthetic arbitrage.
Yeah, so I think a lot of aesthetic traditions are rooted in a kind of understanding of cultural geography, place. And I think as the globalization hits different aspects of society, whether it's something like a pandemic or something like a record, a sound, you have a certain amount of slippage of origin and a certain hybridization that happens everywhere. And that I see in what we do in design is being more and more not just something that can be controlled by the people that control the means of distribution, but something that is in many ways everywhere in which we work. So I think images and understanding of architecture or understanding of design in general is being pushed into a kind of public sphere that is less and less, I would say, hierarchical, and that's something that I think we deal with because our students are much more sort of engaged with that and fascinated by that. I think
thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, Nat. We've got a question from Leslie. She thanks you for your talk, and she said it's important to embed geography in the consideration of your thesis. Can you expand, please?
Yeah, so the conversations with geography as a discipline or as a cognate area has really been that so some of our most important research in the school, George Curry and others, originates in our geography. And also in terms of, it is one of the programs that has been the most, I would say, adaptive to reaching across. We've talked with geography folks about being engaged with geography in many ways, not just as a sort of, I would say, narrow cognate discipline, and they would probably be best to talk about themselves, but also as a kind of cross-disciplinary vehicle by which we think about and look at the world. We've talked to them about a discipline called geodesign, which looks at geography and looks at the world as a kind of data set and sort of uses it as a way to think about different ways of applying that to either the built environment or understanding this. But yeah, I think geography is a really important part of the way in which we operate within the DBE. Mechanically, there's a number of minors and specializations that they have helped to sort of communicate and allow opportunities for students across disciplines to work as well.
All right, next question was Annette Condello.
Hi, Annette.
Hello, Nat. The question I have was, would you be able to explain a bit about what you mean by we need volatility and chaos?
Yeah, I would just say that one of the skills that designers have is that they really, the work of design, and maybe this is broadly, in many ways, is to take disparate pieces of information and organize them in such a way that they can be applied to solve a problem or to better the world. And so when I think about chaos, I think a lot of things are happening that are not necessarily in the control of any one individual or set of individuals. As much as we might like to, we can control the world. But I think designers are the sort of group that are turned to, and I think can really respond to a lot of very disparate pieces of information that may in many ways seem chaotic. And I think many designers respond to that as a sort of real source of a problem, in a real way to energize what their practice is. So that's what I was thinking about that. So when I speak, yeah.
Oh, thanks for clarifying that. No, it was just a bit. I just didn't know.
Yeah.
I was just thinking of chaos theory. I was thinking of, like theories by, what's his name?
Or something.
It's on the tip of my tongue.
Okay.
I'll remember it in a minute. Thank you.
Sure.
Got a question from Neil Crowning. Education in architecture needs to be so broad that awareness and skills in certain areas can run pretty thin. Many skills developed in the real-world contact of architectural practices and the physicality of seeing something constructed. How can a course, as you describe, include such opportunities? Thanks.
Yeah, so the course itself, I mean, architecture is really looking at that as an idea, and maybe Parisa can talk about that. We've looked at ways of allowing for freedom within the course, that is increasing the number of electives, and also ways of engaging in work integrated learning as well as practicums to try to provide day-to-day experiences. I know that a lot of the courses, there are opportunities for students to get access to sites to directly relate. The other thing I think is, and maybe at the subtext of this, is the idea that the sort of making and the sort of collective action of delivering something in the world. In the new building, we have a kind of a makerspace, and in the makerspace, we really are focused on engaging with that level of detail. The only thing I would add to that is that in the design disciplines and in architecture, in many ways, I use the term generalist often, and that the sort of enormity of the task in many ways is to set up a set of criterion or a context or an ethic by which you engage in the larger task, which would happen over time. So yeah, those are some of the ways I think that we can do.
Got a question from Francesco Mancini. Would you see aesthetics as a product of advocacy for ethics?
Yes, I mean, I would certainly see aesthetics as a product for advocacy for ethics. And in my mind, when you say that, I think a lot of that comes to mind where we think about high and low culture around aesthetic practices, and the degree to which designers can bring better aspects, or I would say differing aspects of aesthetics to different populations. So that maybe there's an aesthetic dimension that we bring to the service of providing housing, or the management of a city, or the sort of design or the fabrication of a clothesline. There's always an aesthetic dimension and an ethical dimension that I think interact with one another.
We have a question from Andrew Howe. He enjoyed the talk and thanks you, and he has a query. When you set up curriculum that takes 5 years to deliver, do you think it's important to avoid being reactionary to current agendas, which of course can and do change overnight?
Right. So yeah. So the 5-year professional degree is the base model in the United States, and also is the traditional model here in Australia specifically for architecture. But I know that if you look at other disciplines, say construction management, there's a lot more of an acceleration from a 4 to a 3-year degree. And I know in landscape architecture in the United States, there's a movement from 5 to 3. In architecture, there's a sort of simultaneous movement to a sort of accelerated 5-year degree or an expanded 6-year degree, which is more about bringing research into the fixture. And I do think that all the curriculums try to be as reactive as possible. But the cycles of evaluation associated with accreditation are often 5 or 8 years, as it is in the United States. There's a sort of long time between reviews. And also the institution, the university as a whole, is something which doesn't necessarily change so dynamically. So we review and add and subtract curriculum annually. And so the response that would be necessary to something as sort of unforeseen or dynamic as what we're seeing right now is one that has to be put into that context. So we are, for example, being charged in really trying to participate in the new courses that are being offered around the Recovery Act associated with universities, and where we can participate in that, we will. But much of our disciplines have to do with broad-based bodies of knowledge that are designed to take multiple years of delivery, but also are written over 20, 30 years over the traditions that are much longer than that as well. And they don't change quite as nimbly. But we are really looking at the ability to create what might be called fast casual courses, or opportunities for us to deal with the ability to deal with several issues. One is continuing education or professional development. The other is the sort of upskilling of certain types of technologies or ways of understanding or even representing the world in software, or technologies that we might have that many practitioners would just like to get a sense of. And then the other thing is the sort of cycles of bringing people in and out of education, of practice. So a sort of return to work, which is talking with some of the folks from the Institute, a return to work project that might be the development of a set of tools that would allow someone to step in and out of practice, where they might step out for a sabbatical of sorts professionally, or to be part of a child care family. This might really change the dynamic. So I think it's something that we're responsive to and trying to be attentive to, but there are limits.
Nat, we've got a question from Carol, and then we'll go to Peter, who wants to speak. By the way, if you want to speak your questions, people, just pop your hands up and you can talk rather than type them, whichever's easiest for you. So this question from Carol. Hi, Nat. Thanks for the talk. You've spoken about the school and its success, but what about the students? What are your hopes and aspirations for the students that graduate from architecture? How will our students and graduates be work ready and have more opportunities to be employed post-graduating from Curtin?
Yeah, we've had a lot of conversation about the student population, and it's a group that I've been trying to get to meet. A lot of the meetings that were scheduled for me to engage with students were sort of waylaid by the sort of situation this semester. The university system in Australia is really one that's focused on work learning and accessibility, and so the sort of work integration is something that's on the mind of the school, and we've heard a lot of concern of that coming from practitioners, both in terms of experience and exposure and opportunities. And the notion of a practicum is something that is in the conversation. The deliverable of a practicum for all of our courses and all of our differing disciplines may be less manageable than might happen at a school that is much smaller. But looking for opportunities to provide practical knowledge and bringing students to those experiences are things that we're looking at. There are I think a lot of conversation about that, and I think we see it as a real challenge. But I hope that we're not ignoring it. I wish I had a better answer than that right now, but off the top of my head, that's where I am. Thanks for the question.
Peter?
Thanks, Nat. I was pleased to see your mention of the research side and particularly the giving CUSPA a cognate area even under climate. That was news. But the idea, I was going to ask you a bit like the geography question, how you saw CUSP in this whole thing, but I just wanted to try myself and suggest that, because what came to mind throughout it was the design element that cut across the whole school, and we do have a lot of design elements that underlie a lot of our research. We used to have a DSD, a Doctorate in Sustainable Development, which was very practice-oriented, a professional doctorate. It's shorter, it's more, it has courses in it, and it got put aside and is still sort of sitting there. But I wonder if we oughtn't to think about a DD, not a doctorate in divinity, but a doctorate in design, which actually is based in the practice of the professions, but has a research element to it and enables you to get to those fundamentals of what design can do in practice, as well as in solving deeper, difficult problems like climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there are, I mean, thanks for that. The CUSM in many ways represents one of the strongest aspects in which we've had record in design. I would be remiss in not mentioning the work that we've done in planning by others, also the work in the building information modeling, and some of the work that we're doing in geography, George Curry. So I think there's an excellent tradition of design within the design and built environment collectively. Also some of the work done in fashion historically around research. So I think broadly we can make an argument for research as something that is not in any way a contradiction with design. I think one of the ways that Harvard has a doctorate of design, and they did it for a lot of the reasons you just described, they're looking for something that begins to bring research at an applied level in a more sort of critical conversation with sort of day-to-day application, and they do call it a doctorate of design. Whether it is the degree in sustainability or it is some of the courses that we're looking at to provide access for people to engage in applied research and engage our faculty, I think our research portfolio needs to be a little bit more dynamic. We've talked about a consultancy or something that's more of an exposition, or something that is based less on what might be called the Category 1 excellent tradition out of the Commonwealth, but more the other categories, or more defined around what we do as designers around pre-design development, or sort of engaging and bringing together design ideas. So I really do think that's a real opportunity for us. Thanks for pointing that out. Any other questions?
Question from Justin Owen.
No, it's just one more question. Sorry to be asking too in the space of this.
Sorry.
I was just wondering, in terms of, not necessarily in terms of sustainability, but in terms more of social justice and our, I believe, obligation towards issues of social justice, how do you see architecture amongst the other disciplines, obviously within DB, as a context for advocacy in that respect?
Yeah, so I think that, so my experience, there's a little bit more room in the curriculum for explicit exploration of this, only in that in the American system, the university system also has a general education requirement, typically. Whereas in the Australian system, the baccalaureate, what you do in your sort of your secondary school education, really covers general liberal arts tradition. What that means is that at the university level, there's often a lot more flexibility in explicitly, either theoretically or community-based research ideas by discipline. That said, I do think the better opportunities I see engaged in the research done by individuals such as yourself, Irina, some of our other colleagues that are looking explicitly through the application of studio experiences or research experiences that bring and engage the communities in the particular context that we're in, specifically the reconciliation projects, the notion of visualization, and bringing the skills we have as designers into the consciousness of the way in which we engage with the built environment. I know that a lot of our planning folks are dealing with issues of crime and management of public services. Those are the sorts of ways that we can sort of bring and provide services and not just best practices, but also experiment with ways. by getting at the curriculum in many ways is the sort of foundation by which we exist. We deliver a set of courses, and it is our strongest. Just economically, it is the base which we work. On the other side of that, we have this added value of research, where we can find research that take those cognate areas and specialize and really take them to an extreme. So it's a combination of both. And typically in a university environment, the curriculum is defined by either broader accreditation or staff concerns around the particular course area, whereas the research has a lot more to do with the individual ethic of the people that are bringing it forward. So there's a little bit more engagement in that. But the university itself has an engagement and impact pillar, which I think really brings a lot of social justice pieces forward to the conversation. I don't know if that does that get at your question?
Yeah, I think that develops it. Yeah, it does very much. And I think that relationship both to the university sort of responsibility around that, and also how it then sort of feeds into SDGs and that kind of context is also really important as well.
So I mean, again, thanks for that. We're coming across the. Are there any other comments? But coming at the end of the time, I did want to apologize again for the slides. I'm sure they look better with the color contrast a little better, but I do think it's important for me. I don't know. I think it's a lot to take in. I don't know if it was as clear as I'd like it to be. It's something I'd like for there to be some sense of some response to. So anybody that feels is compelled to write me a note of their thoughts about it, I'd love to hear, either in terms of form or content. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Nat, for sharing your thoughts with us, not just regarding DBE, but also the broader context. And this is, of course, an ongoing conversation that we hope that we can continue in other occasions, since this is very relevant to all of us, educators, students, practitioners, and so on. So very insightful. Thank you for your time. And thanks everyone for joining us. Please stay tuned for the next Architalk, and you'll hear through emails and social media. Thanks everyone. Thanks, Nat.
Bye. Thank you. Thanks for the invite.